It's great to be able to talk to everyone. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to get to Ann Arbor a while ago, but I hope this will work. And University of Michigan was the greatest thing to happen to me. I arrived actually as a freshman in the fall of 1966, which is about 60 years ago. And I lived there for about 10 years. So I would have loved to come. I haven't been back to Ann Arbor for a while. It's an extremely warm place in my heart for the university and the town and all kinds of friends and colleagues there. Now I need to get my talk screen up. Let me explain the title. What is so interesting about reinforcement learning? And I came up with this title because reinforcement learning has been around for a very long time. Common sense idea of learning from the consequences of what we do. If we succeed or if we fail, we learn from those consequences, or more generally from rewards and penalties. And so, and as Satinder just said, that this field is connected to lots of different areas. And that's one of the things that makes it interesting these days. And as Satinder mentioned, it's connected to psychology, control theory, operations research, neuroscience, and of course, artificial intelligence. So these connections are really key to what has maintained my interest over the years. But to begin with, the idea of, I need to talk about my own history before I launch into the history of reinforcement learning. So as I mentioned, I arrived in Ann Arbor a long time ago, and in graduate school, I was a member of a research group called Logic of Computers Group. And the PIs of this group were Arthur Burks, a philosopher and engineer, mathematician, John Holland, computer scientist. I think he had the first PhD from Michigan in computer science, and Bernie Ziegler, who also's PhD was from the University of Michigan. And this group was focused on, let me see, I need to get rid of something on my screen here. Whoops. They were interested in cellular automata, genetic algorithms, and the theory of modeling and simulation. So my thesis was on theory of modeling simulation in the context of cellular automata. So I combined a couple of those things. Art Burks and Bernie were on my committee, as well as John Meyer, who is here in the audience today. So it was a great place because of all the expertise and the focus on computing with an interest in biological connections. And so that was one of the things that attracted me. So I'm very fortunate to have gotten a degree from Michigan, and having been a member of this really quite remarkable Logic of Computers group. But going back to reinforcement learning, I think the beginnings of it they go back much farther than this, but at least to Edward Thorndike, who in the late 19th century studied animal learning, where he'd put an animal, a cat, and other animals too, in a box, and with food outside the box, he would lock it, he would close it in the box, and the animal would fumble around and eventually open the door, let itself out. He would put it back in, and the next trial would take much less time. And so eventually the animal would immediately let itself out. having discovered the way to do it. And this is known now as trial and error learning, or in psychology as instrumental or operant conditioning. And Thorndike coined this law of effect, which has been very influential. And this is a statement of it. It's common sense now, although this has been very controversial in psychology. But basically, if something you do is followed by satisfaction, then connections are made more firmly so that will be more likely to happen again in that situation. And similarly, if discomfort occurs, the animal will lessen those connections. So this is a law of effect. And as I said, it's been controversial in psychology. But now I just highlight here because this is not just achieving satisfaction or avoiding discomfort, but it's also building linkages to situations, to the actions that presumably cause those consequences. Trial and error learning is important to connect that phrase to this type of learning. Okay, now, as I said, it's been controversial, but the philosopher Daniel Dennett has an article called "Why the Law of Effect Will Not Go Away." And he claims, in fact, that it's not just part of a possible explanation of behavior, but of any possible adequate explanation of behavior. Now, I'm not sure I'd go that far, but it's been very influential and seems to us nowadays as common sense. But that's kind of the essence of reinforcement learning, really going way back to those early days. But in computational terms, the way I think of reinforcement learning is as a combination of control, search, and associative memory. So search via trial and error or generate test, variation and selection, whichever phrase you want to pick. Memory, to remember what worked best for each situation and to start there for the next trial, for the next time. And RL, in a sense, is about caching search results. So eventually you don't have to keep searching. And actually using this term memoized search, if you're familiar with that term, but it can be regarded as memoized search. It's not memorized, but memoized. So that's a unique term, meaning that if something is done frequently, some routine is executed frequently, you can just remember the output of it without actually doing the computation. And so that's memoization. And so I think of RL as memoized search. In fact, it's context sensitive search because of the associative aspects. And the generator and the tester should both be smart. And we may return to that later, but it's not necessarily a random flailing around to generate different behaviors. So that's the sort of my view. I'm not sure everybody in the field shares this, but that's how I've always thought of reinforcement learning. Now, so, from a computational point of view, we really developed this further and thought of the agent, a reinforcement learning agent, in a kind of control loop with an environment that generated actions as input to the environment's returning state information and reward information. And this is a discrete time kind of formalization. And we were able to, I've got to remove something from my screen here. It won't go away. Anyway. Sorry. So we developed this connection to Markovian decision processes, which is a discrete time formalization of an optimal control problem. And I should mention that Satinder's thesis from 1994 played a large role in connecting these ideas up to MDPs and therefore to optimal control processes. So let's look at machine learning and see how reinforcement learning compares to other machine learning paradigms. We all know and think of supervised learning, which is learning from labeled examples, sometimes called learning with a teacher. And so a sketch of this is the input, output, and a labeled example. And it's an error correction process. So the error is the difference between the label and the output that was produced. And the mechanisms, the algorithms attempt to minimize this error. And it's used in lots of different contexts: regression, classification, imitation learning, prediction, system identification. It's error correction learning. Then there's unsupervised learning, which is learning from unlabeled examples or learning without a teacher. And one example is clustering, basically organizing examples without the help of labels can be done in many different ways, and one of which is clustering. But this is not reinforcement learning. It's a version of it's unsupervised learning, whereas reinforcement learning is different from both of these. And this is training where the training information is not examples, but evaluations or rewards or penalties. And so the RL system is learning from evaluations, which in most formalisms is a number, is a real number. And the system is trying to increase the amount of reward and decrease the amount of penalty, where penalty is usually thought of as a negative reward, but that's at variance with what psychologists talk about, whereas penalty can be a separate process with different properties. But mathematically, in the simplified version, rewards and penalties are just evaluations of different signs. Sometimes this has been called learning with a critic, recognizing that a critic can evaluate something without knowing what the output or what the output should ideally be. And that's one of the great advantages of reinforcement learning. It makes it slower than supervised learning, but it can be applied in contexts where examples are hard or possibly impossible to get. And this is learning by trial and error, which it can be misunderstood because it's not error correction. It should actually be called trial and evaluation. Going back to what Thorndike was talking about, it's not error correction. It's trying to maximize an evaluation. So that's an important thing. And I've seen this, not recognizing this distinction. I've seen this quite frequently among people who study learning, in fact, but it's important to recognize that trial and error learning is different than supervised learning. It's different than error correction. And I just want to mention one thing here quickly. This is one of the connections that we discovered early on was the fact that a model from psychology called the Rescorla-Wagner model of conditioning for animals, turns out to be essentially identical to the so-called delta rule or least mean square algorithm, which is a basic error correction supervised learning algorithm. But what was interesting is the psychologists and the engineers and computer scientists dealing with the same process, but calling it by different names, really weren't aware of each other. And I think we may have been the first to say these are the same, and that was really interesting. It was illuminating of a lot of things. So anyway, that's just the first connection I think that we really recognized. And it hadn't been recognized before, which was kind of surprising. Okay, some applications of reinforcement learning, board games, backgammon. You probably know some of these, the game of Go, chess, poker, Stratego, video games, Atari, Statecraft, Dota 2, Gran Turismo, a lot of applications in robotics, energy management, self-driving cars. I put it in quotes. They're not quite self-driving yet, but reinforcement learning is being used for that application. Trading and finance, natural language processing, healthcare, for example, tuning schedules of chemotherapy. So this is different than recognizing pictures, say, replacing a radiologist in terms of interpreting x-rays or other scans, but these are sequential, deals with sequential processing, which is another strength of reinforcement learning. Fine-tuning large language models and other applications in large language models. So that's the current craze among AI researchers. I don't know details of applications of RL there, but I see it mentioned whenever I read about some new large language model system. And then deep reinforcement learning is RL combined with deep neural networks. So that really allows the state information to be represented in sophisticated ways that are developed by multi-level neural networks. Okay, let me mention how I got involved in all of this. I became a postdoc at the University of Massachusetts, and there was a center called Cybernetics Center for Systems Neuroscience. And it was directed by Michael Arbib, who was well known for a number of many books he's written. Bill Kilmer, who worked with Warren McCulloch, who was a well-known, he wasn't a neuroscientist, but a theorist working on a model of a particular part of the brain way back in the early days. And Nico Spinelli was a physician and neuroscientist. And they were able to get a contract from the Air Force Office of Scientific Research in 1977 called Goal-Seeking Components of Adaptive Intelligence. And this was intriguing for me, and I became a postdoc for this project. And it was really initiated by Harry Clough, who was a senior scientist with the Avionics Directorate at the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. And he had a theory that neurons are individually hedonists that work to maximize some local analog of pleasure while minimizing a local analog of pain. He wrote a book called The Hedonistic Neuron, A Theory of Memory, Learning, and Intelligence. This appeared in '82, but he had put forward this idea years before. And the idea that Harry had was basically that neurons implement the law of effect. So when a neuron fires an action potential, the synapses that were active in contributing to the action potential become eligible to undergo changes in their efficacies. If the action potential is followed within an appropriate time period by an increase in reward, however that's defined, the efficacies of all the eligible synapses increase or decrease in the case of punishment. So this idea basically is that synaptic plasticity implements the law of effect. And unlike the classical Hebbian model, this involves time. The neurons wait to get the consequences of their activity, which returns to them through feedback loops that are either within the animal or extending outside into the environment and then back through sensory the sensory systems back to the neurons. So that according to this, neurons are working to improve the consequences of their action potentials. So that was Klaus' idea. And the project that I became a postdoc on was to see if this idea made any sense. It was very speculative. And the question was, is this worth studying? Is it something that could lead to something useful, either from a neuroscience point of view or from a applications point of view? And here's a little picture showing that eligibility is something that characterizes the presynaptic terminal, and then the weight is the efficacy is how effective impulses coming through that channel influence the postsynaptic neuron. So eligibility was a key thing, and that may have been original with him, or perhaps earlier, but it certainly was a key part of his hypothesis. So now, some time ago, I gave a talk at a reinforcement learning conference in, where was it? I've been to so many of them lately. It was at the University of Massachusetts, and the title of that talk was, "In the Beginning, Machine Learning was Reinforcement Learning." And so I want to go through a bit of that, because I think that history is really telling. And at some point, which I'll get to. So going way back to the 30s, people were building reinforcement learning systems with electromechanical devices. Here shows work of Stephen Smith from the University of Washington. And it really was a kind of locomotive on some railroad tracks. And it really tried to get to a goal. If it went on a dead end, it would back up and remember not to go there again. And he said, this machine, you can read this, but made great claims for it. No living organism can be depended upon to make no errors after one trial. So this was a reinforcement learning system in 1935. There may have been earlier ones. And then in 1948, Alan Turing wrote about the idea for a pleasure-pain system. And basically, it's the law of effect implemented in a certain way. He proposed this in 1948, the year I was born, and didn't implement it. He didn't have access to a digital computer at that time. But the idea really may have been the first sort of computer science suggestion of how a reinforcement learning system could be implemented. So then I recently discovered this system called Shopper by Anthony Altinger, and it's from the early 50s. And it may be the first machine learning system implemented on a digital computer. And it's very interesting. The shopper simulated, there's a world, and the shopper's looking for certain items, goes to shop after shop at random until it finds what it's looking for. And then it can go back directly the next time it wants that object, but it also remembers what objects are present in each of these other stores. So it's a very interesting, even by today's classifications of learning, it's an interesting system. And it ran on a digital computer, the EDSAC, which was became operational in 1949. So this is, I think the claim is that this is the first machine learning system implemented on a digital computer, 1949. Then Shannon's Theseus was a maze finding rat, but it was actually the maze that was learning. There were relays in the maze that were remembering the trials and errors of Theseus. And so this was on TV back in the 50s and everything. Of course, Shannon is known for information theory, but he was also interested in lots of other things, including machine learning. So now Farley and Clark, I have to quickly go through these. 1954 was the first, as far as I can tell, simulation of a neural network, of an adaptive neural network or a learning neural network on a digital computer. And it was 4K of memory and a less than 1 MIP machine, 64 stochastic linear threshold units, and it was trained by reinforcement learning. There was a proficiency signal, basically a reward signal, that was broadcast to all the elements, all the artificial neurons making up the network. And it was trained by reinforcement learning. And that's the first neural network implementation that I'm aware of on a digital computer. And let me quickly skip this, but it explains how the learning system, learning algorithm actually worked. Then Marvin Minsky, very well known, one of the founders of artificial intelligence. His thesis from 1954 was reinforcement learning. He had components called SNARCs for stochastic neural analog reinforcement calculators. And this system wasn't simulated, it was actually constructed out of hardware. And he argues that it really was quite interesting. You could remove parts of it and it would continue to work. He talks about this in a famous 1961 paper, Steps Toward Artificial Intelligence, from which I think the term reinforcement learning came. He used this term. Psychologists didn't use this term, but Minsky did, and it kind of stuck to this kind of learning. So this was a 1961 paper, worth reading today, I think. And then the notion of credit assignment was very important, which is the problem of getting training information to the right places and at the right times. And so this is still a key problem that current researchers have to worry about. So Minsky's dissertation was a key contribution to reinforcement learning. Then quickly, Farley and Clark's next paper, it was Clark and Farley, and they used the same neural network, but they trained it with supervised learning because they were interested in generalization and other kinds of properties that they had observed in their earlier network, but they didn't use reinforcement learning. It was too slow. This worked better for their purposes. And to me, this is kind of the demarcation when things shifted from reinforcement learning to supervised learning. So this was supervised, as was the perceptron, Frank Rosenblatt's famous learning system from the late 50s. And this was not reinforcement learning. This was supervised. But if you read his book, he uses the term reinforcement a lot, but it's not used in the same way we do now. The error which this system learned from was considered reinforcement. This was extremely influential, of course, and criticized by Minsky and Papert later for its limitations of its abilities, but it's notable that it was supervised. I should mention Setlin, who was a Soviet cybernetician, and he was doing reinforcement learning. And a book that was published posthumously called Automation Theory and Modeling of Biological Systems. It was a genuine reinforcement learning system and has been influential in how we've thought about reinforcement learning. Narendra and Thatachar did a book that surveyed this work. That actually, this is a paper, not a book. They did a book too. But learning automata was interesting for one key thing is that Setlin talked about games and teams. of learning autonomy. So it dealt with multi-agent systems. Then Arthur Samuel, which every student of AI has probably looked at his checkers player. This was reinforcement learning. So again, an early AI system doing reinforcement learning. And in fact, the basic idea that Samuel implemented was that the score was calculated for board positions, and the score was intended to look like what the score would be in the terminal board position of the chain of moves that are most probably going to occur during actual play. So scoring a board was a forward-looking evaluation of going to that configuration. So that predictive aspect of scoring is a key thing in current day reinforcement learning. Okay, and it led to, in the work that we were involved in, it connected to ideas from control theory known as value functions. So a value function here denoted by V of a state S is really the expected sum of rewards over the future, here showing a discounted infinite horizon future. But again, the value is a forward-looking evaluation of a state. And down below, it works too for state action pairs, but we don't need to really consider that. But the point is that these are predictive evaluations that allow reinforcement learning systems, if they evaluate behavior according to value functions, they're really able to evaluate behavior that whose consequences unfold over long periods of time in the future, which is another key aspect of reinforcement learning. Now, and it connects to optimal control and dynamic programming. So some of the algorithms really can be related strongly to dynamic programming. And I think Satinder's thesis really was involved in helping to make those connections. A key connection to that relates to Rich Sutton, who was the co-winner of this Turing Award. And his thesis was the development of what he called the temporal difference algorithm. And the idea here is that this algorithm is a prediction. It's actually a supervised algorithm, but it's able to learn or approximate value functions that extend over time. So the error, known as the temporal difference error, includes the difference between estimates, old and current estimates of future reward. And so these algorithms converge, then the value becomes the sum. I don't have a discount factor in this, but the sum of future rewards, which is this forward-looking evaluation used in reinforcement learning. Okay, I'm going to skip this, but we were inspired, I guess, to try some of these ideas on this pole balancing example that Mickey and Chambers did a system in the late 60s called boxes. They divided the state space up into boxes, and they talked about having a daemon in each box that would keep track of the consequences of the control system's action when it acted in that state represented by that box. And they were able to show that this could eventually learn to balance this pole. It's a classical control problem. And so we thought, well, let's try this with the ideas we've been working on. So we came up with this system for cart pole. We did it in simulation. And it has a decoder, as you can see, and that does the same quantization of the state space into boxes. But the rest of it is really implemented by just two neuron-like units. One we called the associative search element, and one we called the adaptive critic element. And looking at that a little more carefully, the adaptive critic element is really a TD reward predicting element, implementing a TD algorithm, which is supervised. And then the ASC basically implements the law of effect. But the reward goes to the adaptive critic, and its output that is the TD error, which is used as the reinforcement signal for the associative search element. And so this actually worked, and we wrote one of our best cited papers is this 1983 System Man and Cybernetics paper that describes this. And actually, I wrote a paper, I don't know where it appeared, but it's called Looking Back on this work. And it's full of some of the interesting errors that we made in the process. And so if you can find, I don't remember where it was published, but one of the other points of this paper was that from a neuroscience point of view, we were actually suggesting that you might even think of neurons as being much more sophisticated than the standard, in those days, linear threshold element. But systems that had memory and learning algorithms that did, as we were suggesting, these processes. So, and in fact, continued work in neuroscience has shown that neurons are very complicated mechanisms. All right, now I'm out of breath. So Satinder, you should tell me, I'm losing track of time.
How much time does Andy have?
5 more minutes, five or 10.
5 or 10 more minutes, Andy.
Okay. All right. So now Wolfram Schultz is a neuroscientist who's at the University of Cambridge. And he wanted to figure out what dopamine signals in the brain did. The classical view was that dopamine was a reward signal. And he did experiments with awake behaving monkeys recording from dopamine neurons. And the data he collected showed that they didn't seem to be rewards, but something else. And if you look at these, it's hard, I can't describe this quickly enough, but these are histograms showing action potentials of a neuron, a dopamine producing neuron, over multiple trials. And initially, when a reward was given, I say a raisin, the animal was able to pick up a raisin and put it in its mouth, you'd get a burst of dopamine at the time, shortly after the time of the reward. But as training continued, if there was a predicting stimulus called a trigger, in this case, the activity would move backward. It would cease to occur at the reward, but it would move backward to the trigger. Then if an even earlier instruction labeled here occurs, then the dopamine activity would move back to that. And so very interesting and very puzzling to Schultz and his colleagues. And in fact, if you, after the instruction, and if you omit the reward at the time that it used to, at the time that it occurs, you get a decrease in activity. So this was very puzzling and contrary to the usual view of dopamine as a reward signal. But those of us studying TD learning said, oh, this is what the TD error does. And this shows a kind of schematic of these experiments when when there's a predicting stimulus, you get a pulse at the occurrence of the predictor. And if you omit the reward at the time it occurred, you get a negative pulse. This is what the dopamine neurons seem to be doing. And so this led to the reward prediction error hypothesis of dopamine neurons. And so this was put forward by Schultz and Diane and Montague in 97. Other people, including us, noticed that this is like the TD error. And so the phasic activity of mesons of middle brain dopamine neurons signal the error between an old and a new estimate of expected future reward. And so in neuroscience, this is often called the RPE, or reward prediction error. And this has generated an enormous amount of research in neuroscience. And this hypothesis has held up quite well, although things are not as simple as this in the nervous system. But so this to me was very exciting to see this connection. And again, a kind of accidental connection. When the TD algorithm was developed, these data did not exist. And it turned out that this confluence was very surprising and very interesting. And I think, we see these instances of connecting with neuroscience data because animals and these systems we were developing were really facing the same kinds of problems. And so one would expect perhaps that the similar mechanisms might have been developed by us or evolved in animals that amounted to the same type of process. So this was a very exciting finding. Now, collective learning, I mentioned that Setlin talked about this, but for multi-agent reinforcement learning, you can broadcast a reinforcement signal to a team of RL units. It's a team because they're all getting the same evaluation. And this can be made, this with the right learning rule can allow the team members to learn to maximize this shared reward signal. And if you look at neuroscience, you do see this shows the axonal arbor of a couple of dopamine neurons. And the axonal arbor is really what a single neuron is connected to, what its output is connected to. And dopamine neurons connect to many, many, many cells, other neurons in multiple parts of the brain. And so this looks like it could be broadcasting, and that if learning took place via reinforcement learning, one could think about this in terms of team problems. Games are different. If the units are getting different reinforcement signals, then they can have conflicts of interest and so on. And that's very interesting too, because the dopamine system doesn't seem to be unitary like this. It's not the same signal that's being sent to all of the postsynaptic neurons. So anyway, this is a very interesting line of work. And if you look at deep neural networks, as they're called today, you can actually, which are trained by error backpropagation, but you can train them with reinforcement learning. So a hidden unit could be considered a team member, and you can broadcast a reward signal or a TD error to all of them, and they can learn the same as a backprop system, only it's very slow. So now Mike Jordan and I wrote a paper called Gradient Following Without Backpropagation in Layered Networks. And so it's possible to do this with reinforcement learning. It's much, much, much slower than backprop, because backprop is computing these gradients, whereas the reinforcement learning method is estimating them probabilistically. But one could argue that backprop is not very plausible from a neuroscience point of view. And I think a lot of people agree with that, whereas this broadcasting idea is much more plausible. And this is not a closed story at all, but other people have been looking at reinforcement learning style algorithms for multi-layer or deep neural networks. Hedonistic neurons, who knows? But it seems to be a plausible hypothesis. And other topics that I can't cover. What I've talked about is really known as model-free reinforcement learning, which is like classical or Pavlovian conditioning or instrumental conditioning, operant conditioning. Whereas model-based RL can include models, cognitive models, planning, reasoning, problem solving, working memory. So RL is not limited to simple model-free RL. It contains a lot of work on model-based RL. And I'm not completely up to date. I find it impossible to keep up with the latest, but people have worked on better algorithms, better behave, more stable behavior in the learning algorithms, including policy gradient algorithms, which are used in cases where the variables are continuous. Let's say in a robot control problem where torques to joints need to be a continuous quantity. Multi-agent RL, as I mentioned, is another area that's being worked on. Distributional RL, instead of worrying just about expected values, distributional RL estimates the whole distribution. And so it can be related to what is recorded from the brain in experiments. Then there's a field called computational psychiatry, where these models are actually providing ways of thinking about various disorders that occur in human activity. So there is a field called computational psychiatry. And then RL safety is an important area too. There are concerns about releasing reinforcement learning agents into the physical world. And along that line, I mentioned that a key to this is the problem of what should the reward signal be? And there's a whole history going back, certainly to Norbert Wiener, the founder of cybernetics, where he was worried about this problem too. It grants you what you asked for, not what you should have asked for or what you intend. He wasn't doing reinforcement learning, but he was talking about optimization in general. You specify some goal in terms of an objective function, but you don't know beforehand what the system will come up with. And so Nick Bostrom recently called this perverse instantiation. And there are lots of stories and movies and so on about this. Midas's Golden Touch, for example. And there's a wonderful old movie called Bedazzled. There's a current movie, but there's an older one with Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. Is hilarious, but it involves the idea of wishing for something and seeing that it's actually a loophole is discovered to produce something that's completely unexpected. So this is a problem, not just with RL. It's not a new problem, but to me, the idea of releasing self-improving agents into the physical world needs to deal with this problem. And so I think it's an important issue. Now, let me just end by some pictures of some of my students. None of this would have been possible without my students. I've had such wonderful students over the years. There's Satinder, who you know, but there's Rich Sutton there up in the upper left, who was co-awardee of this Turing Award. Chuck Anderson was involved in the very early parts of this. And in fact, his thesis may have been the first deep neural network implementation of reinforcement learning. He's now at the Colorado State University, maybe retired also. Robbie Jacobs, Amy McGovern, and I don't have room for everybody. But now down in this picture, these three are now professors at UMass Amherst, took over the lab. Oh no, this guy is at Brown. Sorry, George Conandaris. This guy is at UMass. So anyway, I've been so gratified to see that UMass hired some of my students, and I wasn't pushing for it. I wrote them letters, but I wasn't saying hire them or else. But they were so good that they became faculty members. Ravindran is in India doing very well. Asghar Simsek at Bath, University of Bath in England. Whoops. Yeah, there are more students, but they've all been deep contributors to this whole area. And finally, support came. The early work was from the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, and then later from the National Science Foundation. And it was basic research. We weren't developing hardware or software. We were studying these ideas. And so the funding for basic research was an essential ingredient to the development of all this stuff. Okay, so just to reiterate, in the beginning, machine learning was reinforcement learning. And then it switched. And now maybe we'll come back to reinforcement learning. So that's the end. And yeah, thank you all for listening. And